This is a very quick overview of custom brushes in Clip Studio Paint or Manga Studio. I already assume that you are familiar with how to customize your layout in Clip Studio. Here we have the subtool and the tool property panels that we're showing. First thing that I want to show is in the upper left hand, if we click on that menu, drop down menu, we can see the settings of the subtool, and it will show you the output process and input process. Now, in the input process can be pen, brush, or pencil, but from what I've been able to tell, they all have the same settings, so they all behave the same way. Okay, so to create your own tool without destroying one that already exists, let's create a copy by duplicate the subtool. And here I'm just going to call it junk because we're just going to play around with that to show how it works. And notice it'll put it at the bottom, and I'm going to drag it to the top. You can also duplicate by just clicking on the thing that looks like a paper, and it'll create a copy. So if you look here, you can see that it has the same properties as the previous tool. Typically we show the tools with their stroke. You can change that by how to show, and tile will show them really showing in the brush tip, or text or small tile. In the lower right we have the tool properties, and I can change the size or the brush density, anti-aliasing, all of these different types of properties including stabilization, and that will affect the pen as I draw. This little icon here reverts the settings, so if I click on it, it will return it to the default values. To the right of brush size and brush density are some drop downs, and if I click on that, it allows me to use pen pressure to affect the attributes. By dragging the squares, I can pull it off or add any number of points to create whatever curve that I would like to create. And this type of dialog appears for any time that there's a drop down, and it affects the behavior of the pen. But the other thing to notice is that you can quickly turn that off. So if I unclick pen pressure, notice here that the brush size is no longer controlled by the pen pressure, but the brush density is. If I go to the brush density, I can turn off the pen pressure there, and neither the size nor the density are affected by the pen, but I can quickly turn them back on however I want it. And so now in this case, the size is affected by the pen pressure, but the density is not. So by clicking on these drop downs, you can very quickly change what the pen pressure affects. Now when I click on the revert button, it will revert all of the properties, including the curves that we have underneath pen pressure. The lock attribute is a little bit strange. Let's assume I normally like to work with the stabilization low, but this tool has stabilization turned on. Well, I can turn it down low and I can work with it. And if I go to another tool and come back, it's down low. But if I turn it back up again and go to another tool and come back, it's still up high. Now I'm going to come down low, and I'm going to click on the lock tool. So now it's down low, and I'm going to turn it up high again. So for this moment, its stabilization is high. I'm going to change tools, and when I come back, it will return it to that locked state. So it's kind of like an override of the initial value, but it's a little bit strange. I'm not sure how useful it is. Okay, so let's look at how to customize the brush itself. And that's done by clicking on the wrench down here. Now as we think about the different customizations we can do to the pen, there's many different customizations you can do in Clip Studio Paint and in other programs. But fundamentally, as we think about the types of strokes that we can create, we can have one that stays constant in density and in thickness of the line. We can have the pen pressure control the thickness of the line, or the pen pressure could control the opacity, or it can control both of them, or we can have texture. So those are the primary attributes that we want to control. In addition, there's the fuzziness or hardness of the line. So a hard edge or a very soft edge. As we look at the brush customizations, we can see the stroke here showing us what's going to happen. Now, many of the attributes you should just play with and see how they behave, but I'm going to show you the most important ones. So we'll start off with brush size, and primarily we're just controlling the default brush size as we move it left or right, what that default is, and you can see that that brush size shows up here and up here in the stroke. And we can see that size. We can also, on the right hand side, is the drop down for the pen pressure and what that looks like. The minimum value means at its very least amount of pressure will be at least 28% of the maximum pressure. So you can set that how you like, and we've shown about the curves. The next thing to notice is this eyeball, and when the eyeball is there over on the right, that will be controllable when you're actually using the tool. So if I click on the eye and it goes away, now I cannot control brush size directly from the GUI. If I click on it, it will show in there, so I can control it very easily at that point. And notice also we've got the control on the drop down. These other attributes, as you would think, specify by size on screen means if I draw in here, let me increase the brush size a little bit. So with that clicked, if I change the size of the screen, the pen stays the same size. If I uncheck it, then the pen becomes smaller or larger with the screen. For ink, this is a very helpful one. Opacity is the thing that we would expect. Here's the maximum opacity, and again you can change it by pen pressure or not. The blending mode is typically normal, but just like for all different layers, there's all different attributes that you could select. Now, mixed ground color is very important if you actually want this ink to mix. So when I click on that, you can select blend or running color. Running color blends the paint a little bit differently. So we can look at an edge, and that's running color. Blend looks a little bit different. Now the key values here are the amount of paint and the density of paint. Color stretch controls how much the paint will stretch out as you blend. But to show this, we have a green patch underneath the blue patch, and we're going to paint on the layer with the blue patch. So first I'm going to set the density of the paint down low, and we're painting with the yellow color. And as I paint, notice that the density, it doesn't color over green, but it will accumulate over time, and eventually it will become dark and occlude the layer below. If I increase the density of the paint and paint here, now we can see that it paints over much more quickly. But notice as I paint on top of the blue, I press hard, but it's not mixing a lot. And that's because what's happening is that the amount of paint is pretty low, and so even though it's not showing through, the density has to do with the alpha or the transparency and how much of the layers below show through, but the amount of paint has to do with mixing with the other layers, other pigments, other pixel values on that same layer. So if I increase the amount of paint and paint over blue, notice that it becomes straight yellow. Put it at 50%, and we are mixing a little bit more of that. And notice if we set the density of the paint and the amount of the paint down low, I can actually kind of erase that layer, and so you can see that green shining through. So this is the most important portion right here in the ink section for any kind of blending that you want going on. And you'll just have to play with the density and the amount of paint. Again, amount is mixing with the paints on the same layer. Density is about how it builds up and how transparent it is compared to the other layers. Now let's come back to that blending mode. I turn the mixing colors off now, and the blending mode I set it to normal, and notice in that case it paints straight over the blue. If I set it to multiply, notice we can see that that's what's happening in the left and right side of the stroke. On the left hand side it's showing what happens as it mixes those colors. Let me set this all the way to 100 and we multiply, and notice that the paint happens, but it multiplies just like if the layer was multiplied. Suppose we set it to compare density, and I turn the opacity down just a little bit. If the opacity all the way up, it paints over. If I turn the opacity down just a little bit, then notice this as I paint, it compares the opacity and won't paint on the thick paint. Okay, now I'm going to set the ink back to full opacity, normal with no mixing, and so that we can see some of these other things. Anti-aliasing should be pretty obvious with a hard edge or a softer edge, but as with some of these other things, they mix with other controls. So let's look at brush shape and specifically brush tip. We have this hardness. So let me go back to anti-aliasing, set it back to no blurring, and we see we get those jaggy edges. But if I go to the brush tip and I turn the hardness down, we have that fuzziness. So that fuzziness, if I put it in the middle, we've got something less fuzzy. And so both the hardness on the brush tip and anti-aliasing can affect what we see in terms of that edge. So let's start looking at brush shape, and it has several attributes associated with it. So in your setup, you may have a number of already pre-registered brush shapes. So the pen, pencil, airbrush, and just by clicking on that, that will set the sub-attributes based upon what the stroke is showing. So if we are using a pencil and we say apply brush shape, now we have the pencil type of appearance. If we have the pen, apply brush shape, we can see that it has whatever that pen is considered watercolor. Same thing for these other types of brush strokes. So all you have to do is say apply brush shape, and it will use those attributes. Notice I can change the name of a brush shape and delete it. And if I go in to any of the attributes and I make a change, let's say to thickness for example, and come back to brush shape, notice it says register to preset, so I can create another preset that is similar but a little different, has been tweaked. Now notice that the different brush shapes that we have here are just these attributes right here. Now the stroke, we see the effect. So for example, if I go to anti-aliasing and I click on the rightmost value, we see that the stroke is showing that anti-aliasing going on. But changing the brush shape does not affect these other attributes. So let's look at some of these important attributes here. So let's look at the brush tip. Now typically we'll have the circle, or you can use a material, and the material could be just about anything because they are the materials that are saved in Manga Studio or Clip Studio Paint, and you can see that there's all kinds of things that could be used for brush tips. But let's focus on the circle for right now. The first thing that we want to show is that hardness, as we had talked about, with it down low, we have very jagged edges, but when it's turned up high for the circle, when the hardness is turned up all the way, we get those jaggies. If I turn it low, then we get that fuzzy edge and something in the middle. We can see how that affects things. Thickness affects the shape of that circular section. So it's a circle if its thickness is all the way up. If we turn it down, it makes it, as we can see, flattened out horizontally or vertically, depending upon how you set it up. That then affects direction, so that we can see, we can get a calligraphy type of effect. That's what the angle. And you can again see what's happening in the brushes. As you drag that, it affects the stroke. Brush density, we can see if I turn that way down, that is similar to opacity. Not exactly the same. It's more like a flow if you're used to Photoshop or maybe Krita or some other applications, and you can see it's a little bit grainy there. So the brush density is similar to opacity in the ink. So we can compare both of those things, and both of those things can be controlled by the pen pressure. So brush density and ink opacity both affect the opacity, as well as we showed, if we're mixing, the density of the paint. So all of those things can affect opacity. I turn all those attributes back up. Let's go to the spraying effect. The spraying effect gives that kind of a grainy appearance. The particle size you can change. The particle density. The spray deviation, how far it goes off target. And the directions of the particle. So the direction of the particle is an angle, and it changes things most if you're using texture. For the stroke, again, you can use that for texture. As you're drawing that stroke, we've got a gap, can be a fixed gap. So we can see we can create the spots or get them closer together, and so that gap is what we can control here, and that's what these are. These are minimum and maximum gaps for more like a painted kind of thing. Continuous spray, this is about if I have an airbrush type of behavior. So if I have it and I just hold it there, it continues to bleed. We see how that bleeding kind of effect. You can have a ribbon and mix brush tips with darken. These are more advanced things, and the ribbon has to deal with textures more. So if we have a texture, the ribbon has to deal with not that texture, but with the brush shape tip if we're using material. So let's select a material. Let's say soft pentagonal. Let's create another one. This blue real pencil. Let's create another one. This braided rope. And you can change the order in which these things appear. Now when we go to that stroke, that's when we can select a ribbon. So you have a ribbon effect, and here we can select, do we repeat? Do we reverse, so the order of things showing up changes? Do they only go in one direction? In other words, you do the first set and then just keep using that last one? Or is it random? So that affects the ribbon. That's what that's all about, the repeat method here. The mix with darken is just a more of an effect here, and you can study that in more detail. Texture is the underlying value. So let me go back to the brush tip, turn that back to circle, and we show texture. In that case, if we select one of these things such as canvas, and the texture density, emphasize, and the ratio, we go and change those. Now if I have the method to apply texture to normal for a number of these textures, we may not really see much of anything, but if you change it to multiply or to subtract or compare one of these other different types of application styles, we can see the texture, and you can change these values to increase the effect of the texture. We can emphasize them. We can change the scale at which the textures apply. So you can get quite a number of different effects. The rotation angle, again, is you have a texture that you're applying. There we go. And it just has a different effect there. Now blurring, or the border of the watercolor, has kind of a light type of effect, and can also be like for emphasis. If we click on the border of watercolor, notice without it, that's what we get. If we click on it, and I'm going to turn border all the way up, transparency, luminosity, process after drag, turn everything up, and we can kind of see the effect that this has over time and how it looks, and it has this kind of a light effect. So you'll have to play with that some. The next, erase, is not used for most pens. It deals with vectors and how they should erase. You have information showing you what to do, how they affect things. Correction, the main point here is stabilization and how that affects things. Usually you want that visible, especially for inking, and you can look at these different attributes. The starting and ending is whether you start with a whether the line tapers off or not, and anti-overflow. So these attributes are not used as much, so they're you can look at them and see how they affect things, but we see how we affect the main attributes of the brush. The other thing that I want to show is that for any of the controls that we display or we show in the GUI, we can have a slider, for example, but also you have seen, like in stabilization, there are these check boxes. So let's look at the brush size. Copy value and copy displayed value, you can look at those. Those aren't commonly used, but it is if you're changing multiple tools at once. But specifically I'm looking at the show slider. Right now the brush size is controlled by a slider, but I may want it to be controlled by an indicator, in which case I could just click on the different sizes. And those sizes would be controlled by the indicator values here. So we can set here the indicator settings, and we can set what the lowest and each of the different, the middle value and the upper value, we can set each one of these values, and that's what these little rectangles will represent. So I wanted to show that part. The last thing to show is this reset all settings to default and register all settings to initial settings. So if you recall, we created the junk by copying Dad's pencil. And notice if I change the brush size, and let's say I change the ink opacity, we use a mixing mode here, let's say whatever things that I want to change in here, and let's say even stabilization, let's turn the stabilization down. So now as I have that, I have a particular brush that I might want to use, and if I go in there and I click on reset all settings to default, what it's going to do is change all of them back to what they were when I originally created it. And so now stabilization is up high again, brush size is back down to 15.1. If on the other hand, let's say that I want a very thin pencil here, and again I'm going to go back to the stabilization, that's easiest to see, turn that down, and whatever changes that I want here, here's a very thin brush, and I want to now register all settings to initial settings. So now it says overwrite the initial settings of the subtool. So what it's going to do is it's going to set it for this particular pen. Now if I change any of these things like anti-aliasing or the brush tip hardness or any of these things, let's say the thickness, now I've changed things quite a bit here with stabilization and the brush tip. Let's make it even larger there so we can easily see. Now if I go and reset all settings to default, notice that it brings back to what we had when we did a register all for this particular tool. So that's the quick tornado view of brushes in Clip Studio Paint. Hope it was helpful.